Imagine something that completely rewrote the operating system of global culture.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm talking about the singular artifact that laid the foundation for the entire video game industry. It influenced almost every genre of modern fiction. It basically invented the whole concept of the geek.
It really did.
And if you're picturing that origin, you'd probably picture this massive, polished corporate launch, right? Like a Steve Jobs keynote or a multi-million dollar marketing blitz.
Right, with trailers and hype men and all of that. That is usually how we think of these world-changing moments being orchestrated. But in this specific case, we're looking at something significantly grittier.
Prettier is definitely putting it lightly. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. I'm your host, and today we are unpacking the original January 1974 Dungeons & Dragons boxed set.
Often referred to by historians as OD&D.
Exactly. And the reality of this thing, looking at our sources, is honestly shocking. Our mission today is to explore how this incredibly messy, difficult-to-play toolkit somehow created a completely new category of gaming.
And we are drawing from historical accounts, original rule books, and design retrospectives to get a complete picture.
Yeah, and looking at the source photos of that first release, it wasn't a polished product in a glossy box. It was this wood grain cardboard box.
Yep.
And it contained three little digest-sized booklets, Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. And, I mean, frankly, it looks like something somebody made in their garage on a weekend.
Well, because in many ways it was, and that is what makes this history so incredible. When you look at the financial side of things, the founders, Gary Gygax and Don Kay, they started the company, Tactile Studies Rules, or TSR, on an absolute shoestring budget.
A literal
We
shoestring.
are talking about a $1,000 life insurance policy. Kay took it out just to get the printing press running.
That is just wild to me. Using a life insurance policy to fund a tabletop game, that feels like a massive gamble.
It really speaks to the desperation and the sheer passion involved. Later on, Brian Bloom joined the partnership and injected another $2,000. But that was it. That was the entire war chest for a product that would go on to change the world.
Wow.
And you could see that tight budget in every single inch of the physical product.
Oh, absolutely. I was looking at the notes on their art budget. They spent a grand total of $100 on artwork for the entire game.
Total. Yeah.
$100. I mean, you can't even get a basic logo design for that today. They were paying friends, what, $2 or $3 for illustrations?
Around there, yeah. And frankly, it shows. Some of the art is legendary for being like, well, let's be charitable and call it rustic.
Rustic is a good word for
It
it.
has this undeniable charm, but it is definitely amateur. But what is truly fascinating is where some of that art actually came from. Because they couldn't afford professional commissions, they were quite literally tracing panels from comic books.
No way.
Oh, yeah. There is a sorcerer and a Viking warrior in the Men in Magic booklet that are directly traced from Marvel Comics. Specifically, Strange Tales, issue number 167.
So the grandfather of World of Warcraft and Baldur's Gate started with traced comic book art and a $1,000 life insurance policy.
Exactly. But despite that rough presentation, the actual mission statement of this box was massive. This wasn't just another board game where you move pieces around a track.
Right, it was a complete paradigm shift.
It was.
Yeah.
You have to understand the context of 1974. Before this, the tabletop hobby was entirely dominated by wargaming. You controlled massive armies. You cared about the macro-level simulation of units, terrain, supply lines, morale.
In general.
Right. But this box set proposed a fundamental ontological shift. It zoomed the camera all the way in. Instead of an entire army, you control one guy, one single hero.
And you're not trying to win a war anymore.
No, you're trying to survive a narrative. It was an incredibly messy toolkit, but it shifted the focus entirely and created a brand new category of play.
But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly pretty confusing for me. If you buy a game today, say Monopoly or Catan, you expect to open the box, read the rules, and just play the game.
Naturally.
But the sources explicitly say OD&D wasn't actually a standalone game.
Correct. And this baffles modern players who go back and try to read the original text.
Mm.
The box clearly says rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns. But if you open it up, you literally could not play the combat without owning a completely different game called Chainmail.
And Chainmail was the miniatures game Gygax had worked on previously, right?
Exactly. The OD&D rules explicitly tell the reader to consult Chainmail for combat resolution. So imagine you buy this new box, but you can't actually fight any monsters unless you go back to the store and buy this other book.
That is so frustrating.
And it gets worse. For wilderness exploration, so walking through a forest or finding a dungeon, the rules literally told you to go buy a board game called Outdoor Survival, which was published by a rival company, Avalon Hill.
Wait, really? A rival company?
Yes. You're supposed to buy Outdoor Survival and just use that game's physical board as your world map.
So you buy the D&D box, but you need a miniatures game for fighting and a random board game for walking around. That is some assembly-required energy.
It creates this fascinating confusion in the text for anyone reading it today. For example, the movement distances and the spell ranges in the booklets were all listed in inches.
Inches, like on a literal ruler.
Yes, because it assumed you were playing on a large tabletop with a tape measure, just like a wargamer playing with miniature lead soldiers.
Yeah.
1 real-world inch equaled 10 feet in the game world.
Okay, I see.
But if you were just a regular person trying to play this new role-playing game, without that hardcore wargaming background, reading that a fireball has a range of 24 inches is incredibly confusing. Do I need a ruler? Is the fireball literally 2 feet long on my kitchen table?
It's like reading a manual for a car that assumes you already know how to build a transmission from scratch.
That's a perfect analogy.
And speaking of confusion, let's talk about the scale of the game. Because I always picture D&D as a group of 4 or 5 friends sitting around a table with some snacks, but the original rules suggest a much, much bigger operation.
Oh, it was a totally different beast back then. They envisioned a pool of up to 50 players who would sort of drop in and out of the campaign from week to week. And the rules actually recommend a ratio of 1 referee to 20 players.
20 players at one single table? That sounds like an absolute nightmare to manage.
It would be, if not for the caller. The caller was a vital mechanic back then that has totally disappeared from modern gaming. You didn't have 20 people shouting, "I attack the orc," or "I check the door for traps."
Thank goodness.
Right. Instead, you had 20 people debating amongst themselves in a group. And then one person, the caller, would act as the foreman. They would turn to the referee and officially state, "The party is moving 30 feet north."
It sounds more like a corporate board meeting than a dungeon crawl.
It was absolutely a logistics operation as much as it was a game. You have to remember, they were inventing this medium in real time. They didn't really know what worked and what didn't yet.
And there's one really funny detail I caught in the sources regarding the equipment, specifically the dice. We all know the 20-sided die, the D20. It's the icon of the whole hobby. But the sources mention that the 10-sided die didn't even exist.
Not commercially, no. The 20-sided die existed mostly for educational or statistical purposes, but the 10-sided die wasn't readily available until around 1980. This created a huge problem because the game constantly asked for percentage rolls, generating a number between 1 and 100.
So how did they do it if the dice didn't exist?
You had to use a 20-sided die, but it was numbered 0 to 9 twice. You'd roll it, and let's say you got a 4. That could be a 4 or a 14, or in percentage terms, a 40.
How do you tell which is which?
You literally had to color in half the numbers on the die with a crayon to tell the difference, or just try to mentally track it. It is just another layer of that barrier to entry that simply doesn't exist for players today.
Incredible. Okay, let's unpack the world itself now, because when I think of early D&D, my mind immediately goes to Tolkien. I think of high fantasy, serious tone, elves and dwarves, maybe a bit dry. But looking at these original encounter tables, there are dinosaurs in the swamps.
Yeah, the setting of OD&D is what historians generally call gonzo. It really challenges this modern idea that D&D started as a pure, polished Tolkien clone. It was really a massive mashup of everything Gygax and his co-creator Dave Arneson thought was cool.
Right, like the sources mention Martian creatures just wandering around in the desert.
Yes, straight out of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom series.
Yeah.
You have Banths and Thoats, these giant multi-legged Martian beasts just running around in the sand. And then in the mountains, you might stumble across prehistoric Neanderthals.
That is so weird.
It wasn't a cohesive, logical ecology. It was a funhouse. The encounter tables literally dictated the reality of the world on the fly. If the table said swamp, you rolled a die, and you might just get a Tyrannosaurus Rex. If the table said castle, you might get a militant Templar or a knight challenging you to a medieval joust.
So it's basically King Kong meets John Carter of Mars meets King Arthur.
Exactly. It's pulp fantasy. And sticking with that world building, the religion or rather the lack thereof, is fascinating. Today, if you play D&D, there are these massive, detailed pantheons of gods. But in 1974,
The sources called it theological ambiguity.
right, there were no named gods, no Peeler, no Morden, no specific deities to pray to. There was just this cosmic, abstract struggle between law and chaos. And this was heavily inspired by the fantasy authors Poul Anderson and Michael Moorcock.
So you just picked a side in a cosmic war.
Pretty much, you didn't pray to a specific person, you aligned yourself with a cosmic force.
But then, and this is where it gets confusing again, you have this highly specific detail where clerics use crosses.
That is the jarring part. To turn away vampires, the equipment list explicitly mentions wooden and silver crosses. Not generic holy symbols like we have today. Specifically crosses.
That implies a lot.
It does. You have this strange mix where the game implies a real-world Christian undertone because they imported the classic Dracula vampire mythos, but they layered it right over a pulp fantasy world full of Martians and dinosaurs.
It feels like they were just grabbing whatever cultural artifacts were closest to hand and tossing them into a blender.
That's exactly how it was designed.
Now let's get into the mechanics, because if there's one theme that stands out in the sources, it's that life is cheap.
Oh, life is cheap is almost an understatement.
Yeah.
If you play modern tabletop games, you generally expect your character to be a hero from day one. In OD&D, character creation was absolutely brutal. You rolled 3 6-sided dice for your stats, strength, intelligence, and so on. But you had to roll them strictly in order.
So you couldn't say, hey, I really want to play a strong fighter, and just put your highest number into strength.
Absolutely not. You rolled your strength score first. If you rolled a 5, you were weak, period. There's no fixing it. Then you rolled intelligence. If you somehow rolled an 18 for intelligence, well, guess what? You were playing a magic user whether you wanted to or not.
So you didn't build a hero, you just sort of discovered what poor soul you were stuck with.
Precisely. And the math on that is harsh. Getting a high stat was incredibly rare.
Because it's a bell curve, right?
Exactly. Rolling an 18 on 3 dice is less than a 0.5% chance. So most characters were stunningly average or even well below average. And the classes you could choose from were very distinct. You basically had the fighting man, the magic user, and the cleric.
The fighting man! I just love that terminology. It is so perfectly literal.
It is very straightforward. And the fighting man was the only class that could use all weapons and all magic armor.
Yeah.
Then you had the magic user, who was incredibly fragile. They started with a single 4-sided die for their hit points.
Wait. 1d4.
Yes. That means a standard house cat could technically kill a level 1 wizard in a fair fight.
That is hilarious and terrifying. And the cleric. The sources say they couldn't even use edged weapons.
Right. They had a strict rule against shedding blood, so they could only use blunt weapons like maces. But the most surprising thing for modern players looking back is that a level 1 cleric has 0 spells. None at all.
Wait, a spellcaster with no spells? What did they even do?
They were basically just a secondary fighter who had the ability to turn undead. And even that ability, turn undead, wasn't originally about blasting zombies with holy radiant light like it is today.
How did it work?
In Dave Arneson's original Blackmoor campaign, which predates the published box, it was used more like crowd control. He described it like a border collie herding sheep. You weren't vaporizing the undead, you were literally just pushing them back into a corner so the rest of the party could sneak past.
I absolutely love that image. Just a guy holding up a wooden cross and shouting, back, back, into a dark hallway.
It was very practical.
And we definitely have to talk about the elves. The sources highlight this thing called the elf quirk.
Oh, this is one of the strangest mechanics in the whole box, and it confuses everyone who reads it today.
Yeah.
An elf could be a fighting man or a magic user, but they could not be both at the same time.
What does that mean in practice?
It means at the start of every single game session, the elf player had to declare to the table, "Today, I am a fighting man." And for that whole session, they could wear heavy armor and swing a sword, but they couldn't cast a single spell.
Okay.
And then the next time the group met to play, they could say, "Today, I'm a magic user." They would take off the armor, put away the sword, and suddenly they could cast spells again.
That is genuinely bizarre. It's almost like having a split personality. Like, sorry guys, I can't read this magical scroll today. I'm feeling very martial right now.
It really reflects a game design that was still figuring out its own identity. They didn't know how to mechanically balance a character who could fight well and cast spells, so they just made you choose one role at a time.
And speaking of identity, the way you actually leveled up in this game changed the entire behavior of the players. We need to talk about XP for gold.
Yes, this is the defining mechanic of early D&D.
Because it blew my mind. You didn't actually get much experience for fighting and killing monsters.
Very little. A monster might give you 100 experience points per hit die. But gold. One gold piece equaled one experience point. Let's say you encounter a troll. If you risk your life to kill it, you might get 700 XP. But if that troll happens to be guarding a chest with 7,000 gold pieces inside.
Getting the gold is worth 10 times more than the actual kill.
Exactly. So it changes the incentive structure completely. You are no longer a heroic warrior seeking glory in combat. You are a thief seeking a payout.
Which turns the whole game into a heist movie.
Precisely. Smart players learned very quickly to avoid combat whenever possible, because combat was incredibly deadly. Remember, almost all weapons did one six-sided die of damage. A tiny dagger was just as lethal as a massive two-handed sword.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, the rules were that simple. So the risk of dying was huge, and the reward for fighting was low. The ultimate goal was to sneak in, trick the monsters, steal the treasure, and get out alive without ever drawing your sword.
Which perfectly explains the morale system too, right? Because the monsters didn't just fight to the death either.
No, they didn't. If the battle went south for the bad guys, the referee would roll some dice, and the monsters might just surrender or run away. The game wasn't meant to be a strict combat simulator. It was a negotiation and resource management simulator. The monsters wanted to survive just as much as the players did.
Okay, so let's say you do survive. You sneak past the troll, you steal the gold, you get the XP, and you level up. What was the actual end game? Because today, people usually just stop playing when their characters get to a high level, or the real world group just falls apart due to scheduling.
In 1974, reaching high levels meant the game shifted genres entirely once again. At a certain point, you stopped being a wandering adventurer, and you became a landlord.
A landlord.
Yes. The fighting man would use their wealth to build a castle and command literal armies. The cleric would build a massive religious stronghold, which would attract faithful soldiers who would serve them for free, and the magic user would build a wizard's tower to conduct magical research.
So you literally go from playing Ocean's 11 to playing SimCity.
That is a great way to put it. It returned directly to its wargaming roots. You were now a political entity on the map. You had to manage taxes, border patrols, and expanding your territory. And the game had specific mechanisms to handle your growing impact on the world. My personal favorite is the Angry Villager rule.
Oh, please explain that one.
It was a built-in mechanism for dungeon masters to punish murder hobo players.
Murder hobos being the type of players who just wander into a peaceful town and kill the local shopkeeper to get a discount on a rope.
Exactly. The rules actually provided a mathematical formula to summon an angry mob of peasants, or the high-level city watch, to completely crush those players. It wasn't just the DM saying, hey, I'm mad at you for ruining the story. It was an objective, mathematical system to enforce consequences for bad behavior.
I feel like a lot of modern video games could still use that exact rule, but obviously with a game this influential expanding this fast, there was bound to be trouble. We have to talk about the corporate warfare and the legal battles.
It really wouldn't be D&D without a major lawsuit. And the first big one came from the Tolkien estate. Because remember, the original box set used the actual words Hobbit, Balrog, and Ent.
They just put them right in the rulebook. They didn't even try to file off the serial number.
They just used them. And the Tolkien estate immediately sent a cease and desist and said, absolutely not. So overnight, Hobbits became halflings, Ents became treants, and Balrogs became Balors.
So that's why we have those terms today.
Exactly. If not for that specific lawsuit, we'd probably still be calling them hobbits in every fantasy game.
But the bigger conflict was internal, wasn't it? Between the original creators, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And just to remind you listening, we're not taking sides here. We're just looking at the historical record of what happened between these two.
It is a very tragic part of the history. Dave Arneson was the co-creator. His name was right there on the original box. He was the one who actually invented the core concept of role-playing in his Blackmore campaign, while Gygax provided the underlying mechanics to make it a sellable product.
So they needed each other.
It did. But as the money really started rolling in, TSR, specifically Gygax and the Bloom brothers who controlled the company, tried to push Arneson out. During the ensuing legal battles, they even claimed in court documents that Arneson wasn't an author of the original D&D materials.
That seems incredibly harsh, given that the whole conceptual spark seems to have come directly from his gaming group.
It was a bitter dispute, and it led to a very cynical business move. Gygax went on to create Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or AD&D, And he did this specifically to claim it was a completely different game from original D&D.
So he wouldn't have to pay Arneson royalties on the new books.
That was the argument. He argued that basic D&D and advanced D&D were legally distinct products.
Even though AD&D had the exact same classes, the same spells, and the same monsters.
Essentially, yes.
Huh.
And this created a massive rift where you had two completely incompatible product lines running side by side for decades. You had basic D&D on one shelf and advanced D&D on the other. It confused consumers for years.
When did that finally end?
It wasn't until Wizards of the Coast bought the failing TSR in 1997. They finally paid Arneson an undisclosed settlement and unified the brand into the single D&D game we know today.
So despite all of that, the lawsuits, the clumsy rules, the traced comic book art, the fact that you needed 2 other games just to play it, people are still playing this exact 1974 version today. The Old School Renaissance, or OSR, is a huge movement in gaming. Why? Why go back to something that is so arguably broken?
It comes down to a design philosophy of negative space. Modern games, and modern video games especially, have a rule for absolutely everything. If you want to jump over a pit, you roll acrobatics. If you want to persuade a guard to let you pass, you roll persuasion. You look down at your character sheet to find the answer to your problem.
But OD&D didn't have any of that.
None of it. OD&D had massive gaps in the rules.
So what do you do if you want to persuade a guard in 1974?
You, the actual player sitting at the table, have to persuade the referee. You have to use your words and describe exactly what you are doing. You say, I offer him a 10 gold piece bribe, or I tell him his shoelace is untied and run past him.
So it's about what you think of, not what your character's stats are.
Exactly. It is player skill versus character skill. You can't just look at a piece of paper and push a button to solve the problem. You have to look at the fictional situation and use human logic.
That actually sounds really refreshing. It forces you to be genuinely creative.
That is the core appeal of the OSR movement. It's this beautiful tension between the Gygaxian naturalism, which is the strict tracking of torches, time, and encumbrance, and the Arnesonian theatricality, where you can attempt literally anything you can imagine because there isn't a rule explicitly saying you can't.
So the fact that the rules were incomplete was actually its greatest strength all along.
I believe so.
Yeah.
It demanded that the players fix it. It demanded that you use your own imagination to fill in the blank spaces. It wasn't just a polished product you passively consumed. It was a DIY project you actively participated in. And that required participation is exactly what hooked a generation of people for life.
So bringing it all home, we started with a cheap wood grain box, a $1,000 life insurance policy, and some art traced out of a comic book.
And we ended up with a global phenomenon that fundamentally redefined modern entertainment. The paradox of original D&D is that it was amateurish, confusing, and completely broken by modern standards. But that exact brokenness is what forced people to be creative, sparking an entire industry.
So here is a final provocative thought for you listening. If modern games have solved every single problem with a dice roll or a specific mechanic, if we now have a perfect rule for absolutely everything, have we lost the actual game of creative problem solving that defined that original 1974 experience? Something for you to chew on the next time you reach for a D20. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Keep exploring, everyone.